This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.
Although there were a lot of moa from one end of New Zealand to the other, it's not like there were just herds of them wandering around the bush en masse kind of thing. They're pretty solitary. So you've got solitary moa going around pruning the vegetation. Compare that to a bunch of deer or goats or something that en masse are just going to go through and eat everything on the forest floor. So yeah, there is no replacement for something that evolved for 50 million years.
Today's episode of Rewilding in Action is supported by Bin Dunedin at 126 Crawford Street. Locally owned and operated, Bin Dunedin specialises in quality whole foods, speciality grocery items and low-waste shopping options. For more information, go to binin.co.nz. Kia ora, welcome to Rewilding in Action with me, your host, Maureen Howard. Now, recently there's been a lot in the media about bringing back moa. The 9 species of moa, giant flightless birds that evolved in New Zealand, are thought to have had significant roles in the terrestrial ecosystems of Aotearoa. I'm really interested to understand more about the effects of the rapid extinction of moa around 500 to 600 years ago and how it's still affecting ecosystems today. For this episode, I'm in the OAR FM studio, this time with my guest, Quinn Berendsen, who's the author of a very readable and comprehensive natural history book published in 2012 called The Moa, The Life and Death of New Zealand's Legendary Bird. Quinn is a design lecturer, writer, documentary maker and photographer who's working at the Otago Polytechnic. So welcome to the OAR FM studio, Quinn.
Thank you very much, Maureen. Nice to be here.
So I was wondering if you could perhaps start our conversation and maybe by unpacking what a keystone species is and which of any of our moa species were keystone species.
Well, I guess in simple terms, all species in an environment are important, but some have bigger influence on things than others. Some, put it this way, a keystone in an arch is the stone that actually holds the whole arch up. So it holds the thing together. So a keystone species, you could think of it like that. So it has often described as a disproportionately large impact on the things around it and as a kind of influencer, I guess, if you like. And without them, ecosystems start to unravel and kind of fall to pieces a bit. So they kind of add stability to an ecosystem. And, keystone species really influence the evolution of other species as well. So that's where the influence comes in as well and can influence a whole environment, even the physical shape of the environment. They can engineer environments. So things like beavers building dams and damming up streams, that has a massive impact, their creations, and all kinds of other species benefit from what beavers do. So that's an example, easy example of a keystone species, literally engineering the environment and changing the physical shape of it and creating little niches and opportunities for other things. And so you take beavers out of those environments, they're just not the same, and those opportunities disappear for those other animals.
And if we think back to the moa, obviously there were 9 species and pretty hefty species.
Many of them, yeah, absolutely. Some of the biggest birds that ever lived, ever. Yeah. So, we're talking about big animals here.
Yeah.
And lots of them in 9 different kinds. And they were here for a very long time as well. So time's a big factor, I think, in this keystone species concept. These species tend to have been around for a very long time, so the environments start to change around them because of their presence. So in the case of the moa, we can kind of calculate by using sort of molecular genetics and things that, they've been in New Zealand for say 50 million years, some form of moa, not necessarily the 9 that were here when humans arrived, but some ancestral moas doing their moa thing. And 50 million years is a very long time and long enough for them to have had a massive impact on the shape of the forests around them. And then, of course, they disappeared very, very quickly, quite recently. So as far as the forests are concerned, they're still there. It's a heartbeat ago, 500 years in terms of geological time. So it's a blink of an eye, really, in terms of those ecosystems.
And we can get little glimpses into how they lived by looking at different things that we found. Obviously, the coprolites, which is their fossilised species. Poos,
very, very useful. Not very glamorous, not as glamorous as a whole moa skeleton or something like that. But for ecologists, for looking at, how the moa actually lived, absolute gold. You can see what they were eating, you can see what was around, what kind of environment they were in. And fortunately, there is a lot of that kind of stuff preserved in rock shelters and things like that where they used to nest and things. So scientists have been able to, find coprolites from all 9 species and really start looking at the kind of fine detail of exactly what they were eating.
Yes. I guess the different species were browsing in different ways, weren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see that even just from the shape of their beaks. So you can kind of imply some have much sharper, stronger beaks than others. For example, there's a species, the heavy-footed, which is thought to have lived in swamps or on the edge of swamps, really sharp beak, and they've found things like flax in its coprolites, which is pretty tough stuff. So you could have a pretty sharp beak to tackle those kind of things. And other species that had more sort of rounded, less powerful beaks that would suggest they were eating softer vegetative material.
Like fruit, perhaps?
Yep, absolutely, and just softer leaves. But, the interesting thing, say, take the giant moa, for example, and there was one species in each island. They were the real generalists, and, surprisingly, they were found to feed a lot on really small things on the forest floor, so moss, small shrubs, even fungi. So, of course, they would have spread those things around, and it's thought the giant moa were quite nomadic and kind of moved around the place and might have seasonally moved up into the hills a bit at certain seasons to take advantage of things blooming or flowering. So you can imagine that they would have a big impact spreading seeds and spores and things around the place in the way that other animals do. You become part of the reproductive cycle of those plants, basically.
Yeah. I know there was a paper out this year about the truffle-like fungi. I don't know if you read that.
Yeah.
In New Zealand, we've got these amazing fungi that are really colourful. And in the Northern Hemisphere, they're kind of brown and smelly. But here they're very colourful and they attract a bird.
Yeah.
An animal
absolutely,
that sees
just
colour.
like fruit. And doing that on purpose because the moa is going to spread them around the place.
And without the moa there, what's eating them? What's spreading their spores, I should say?
I honestly don't know whether introduced browsers like deer and things bother with those fungi, or maybe nothing. Maybe that's the problem.
Apparently they're declining and quite a few species
It's what you'd expect if their chief kind of spreader is not there anymore. So, that's one example, and you can just imagine that there would have been many other plants. It's really interesting. You can see how much the moa influence the evolution of plants, and it kind of pushes them in 2 different directions. It's either avoid the moa and avoid getting eaten at all costs. And the classic example there is the lancewood, which, is a well-known kind of ornamental plant and has these quite dramatic dagger-like kind of leaves hanging down when it's small. But when that plant hits 3.5 meters tall, it completely changes, and all the big dagger spear-like leaves just turn upwards into a kind of a ball, and it just becomes a normalish tree again. And then when you consider that the absolute tallest moa were about 3.5 meters, so that's as soon as it gets beyond the reach of moa, basically it changes dramatically.
So there might have been some competitive avoidance between them as the moa got taller.
Absolutely.
The lancewood had to get taller.
Absolutely. And it goes to a lot of trouble to not get eaten. And in fact, the juvenile lancewood and the adult tree are so different that they were thought to be 2 different species for a really long time. And there's also a close relative on the Chatham Islands, and there were never any more on the Chathams. And the close relative just skips the whole dagger leaf stage completely and just grows like a normal plant.
That's a really interesting comparison, isn't it? You kind of got this comparison island which didn't have moa.
Yep. So it kind of, really I guess, sort of proves the point. And then there are other growth habits. I don't know whether you've mentioned divaricating plants on your show, where they grow woody, twiggy bits are on the outside and the leaves are kind of protected inside like a bit of a cage. And potentially that's for a kind of insulation, thermal insulation, climate reasons as well, but it sure does a good job of protecting the delicate new leaves. So, you see many examples of New Zealand native plants that are going to quite great lengths to avoid being browsed. But then there would have been a whole bunch of others that were doing the opposite and the fungi and trying to attract the moa to eat their fruit or whatever it is that they would help spread them. So as a keystone species, the moa is going to have impact both ways. It'll push things into kind of defence, or it will make other species, kind of reliant on it. So when you take moa out, both of those kind of ends of things are affected.
And then what about how the moa moved around? Obviously, there was 9 different species, so they were occupying different niches.
Yep.
The South Island giant moa, they were a forest species, weren't they?
They were the real generalists. So those are the kind of nomadic type ones. They're the ones that are considered to be, could have lived pretty much everywhere, moved around a lot, could pretty much eat anything from, they've found snipped off twigs of big podocarp type species down to the little fungi and moss and things. So others were probably a bit more restricted and could probably only access certain kinds of plants or certain sort of sub-environments.
Yeah.
So, you had your sort of swampy ones. There was a species called the upland moa that lived up in the tussock in the snow line, so only found in the Southern Alps. So
what was the forest species? What ones were those?
The little ones, the smallest ones, the little bush moa. Yep. So they're definitely, it's thought that most species would have preferred the kind of edges and margins where you've got the most species. Like in the middle of the bush, often there's not much on the forest floor, whereas on an edge you get the smaller shrub type things as well. So that would be the ideal spot probably. But the little bush moa, I think, were like right in the deepest forest as well, kind of racing around on the forest floor.
Making little tracks.
Yeah, quite likely. And, it's thought that most moa were track-making and territorial. So even in that regard, starting to just physically shape the forest just by pruning it, basically. So you just think that their beaks are like little cicateers just snipping things off everywhere. So even the physical shape of plants and the physical kind of, it's possible the forest floor was a bit more open when moa were around because they would have kept certain things trimmed back. It's really hard to measure, but the composition of especially the forest floor might have changed. Certain plants have become rarer, certain plants would have become more common since the moa have gone.
Right. Oh, that's quite interesting.
Yeah, it's really hard to measure exactly which ones, though, and you don't get quite enough information from copulates.
Well, the ones, I guess, that are avoiding the moa
Yeah.
might be more common.
Yeah, absolutely.
The ones that are reliant on the moa for
reproduction.
Seed dispersal and so forth.
Are likely to have, unless something else was also doing it or something else has picked up the mantle, then, you would see the distribution of some things go down.
And one thing, they used to think that the vegetation in Europe before humans started burning and cutting and everything, it was very densely forest all across. But now they're changing that because there would have been a lot of big herbivores moving around and clearing areas, and it would have been a lot more shrubland and so forth. And I'm just wondering if moa really had a very significant impact, perhaps like that, and perhaps in the past our forests were a bit more open than maybe they are in Fiordland today.
Highly likely. I mean, Fiordland I don't think was ever a great moa habitat anyway. They tend to be a bit less biodiverse, those really thick, wet forests. So there was only probably 1 or 2 species that could probably handle Fiordland. But, a lot of the forests that the moa lived in, especially where we are in Otago, are gone. That whole kind of forest is gone. There was a whole kind of eastern dryland forest of the South Island that, especially in places like central Otago, is thought to have been dominated by like kowhai and things. And there's just none of that left. Yeah. So we have no idea what that forest was like. But I think it would be fair to say that there's a high chance that, as you said, like in Europe, that things were a bit more open in places where there were a lot of moa.
And I wonder, because you said they're quite habitual, they made these tracks. If perhaps humans, we're making little tracks. And if there's a certain correlation, between some of our behaviours and the behaviour of the moa.
Well, I mean, humans clocked on to the fact that they could find moa easily by following their tracks. And maybe they adopted some of their tracks into their human main tracks, and then eventually they became roads, which tends to happen. A lot of our roads in the South Island, especially across the mountain passes, are based on old Māori paths. Maybe the moa made them first.
That's so cool.
Yeah. But yeah, look, the physical measurable impact, even though we don't know the exact details of it, I think it's obvious that they would have. That size of animal, that many different kinds here for that long. And there was no other competition, that's the other thing, is that the reason why there were 9 species of moa, there was nothing else eating vegetation on land, really. So they were able to go out and fill every niche that in Europe was filled, from everything from little tiny things up to deer and cows and the big 4-legged stuff. So in New Zealand, just moa were doing all of those jobs. So they would have had the impact of all of those things in Europe put together.
Yeah. Now, some people have made the argument that the introduced mammals that we have now are kind of replacing some of the functional behaviour and actions of moa.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
I think there's people who really want that to be true. But if you think about it, those animals are so recent that there is no time for New Zealand's plants to have kind of adapted functional relationships with them, because they've only been here in some cases only 100 years or 150 years. So they feed differently, they eat differently. If you think of moa just kind of snipping little branches off, whereas things like deer or rabbits or goats will kill a plant. They will ring bark it and kill a little seedling. So yeah, it's different. The forests of Europe had evolved with deer and pigs and all of those things for millions of years, so they knew how to handle them. And I mean, although there were a lot of moa from one end of New Zealand to the other, it's not like there were just herds of them wandering around the bush en masse kind of thing. They're pretty solitary and probably lived in a fairly low density. They were everywhere, but they weren't in great, So you've got solitary moa going around pruning the vegetation. Compare that to a bunch of deer or goats or something that en masse are just going to go through and eat everything on the forest floor. So yeah, there is no replacement for something that evolved for 50 million years, unless you wait for another 50 million years. You know what I mean? There's no shortcuts to this kind of thing.
So in my little introduction, I talked about this idea of bringing species back, reintroducing them. And because the moa is completely gone, we have got people excited about de-extinction.
Yeah, the big news.
It is. And so let's talk a little bit more generally about de-extinction.
Sure.
Briefly.
Yep.
What do you think are some of the challenges of that in terms of bringing back moa?
Well, look, I'm not the technical person in terms of the nitty-gritty of how they're doing it, but they're not the first people to try. The pathway theoretically has been there for a few years. I think I mentioned it right at the end of the book. So even 12, 13 years ago, the moa was on the kind of top 10 list of species that you could do it with, because it ticks quite a few of the boxes, which is it's recent, so you can recover DNA from moa. DNA starts degrading as soon as the animal dies, so you've got to have something pretty recent, otherwise you lose all of the information in DNA. So we've got, 500-year-old moa bones from the ones that are found in caves and things like that have really well-preserved DNA. There are close relatives still alive, so you need some kind of foster mum or at least a base model that you can start tinkering with.
But I thought their closest relative is the tinamu.
It is. The current bid, the colossal bid, is based around emu, apparently,
right, okay.
Which are, I guess, size-wise a bit more manageable. And emu and moa would be, 99% identical in their DNA. But that 1% is millions and millions and millions. There's so much information in DNA that even though it sounds like it might not be a big deal to change that 1% or whatever, it is a lot. So it's not going to be a moa as such. it's a moa simulation or a genetically modified emu that starts to show some moa-like traits. And I'm not sure how many changes they're going to do. The very famous direwolf experiment that happened last year, that was their kind of first crack at it. They only made 20 changes or 20 edits to a wolf's DNA and put 20 direwolf sequences in. So not very many. I think they're planning to do more with the moa, but I don't know if they're going to try and do all of them. Is it millions of changes? Can they do that yet?
Yeah. And the other thing is then how do they behave, and how would we even know what is the appropriate way for them to behave?
I think that's one of the big problems, especially because they're talking about incubating these things in artificial eggs, so they won't even have a mother. A few years ago, the kind of path was you would create an embryo and then implant that in that kind of foster mother close relative so that it actually gives birth to something. But in this case, they seem to be wanting to skip that stage and create these things in a lab and then just kind of turn them loose, I guess. But we know that from moa and its close relatives, the parent, and especially the father, who's usually the smaller one of the pair, looks after the babies for over a year. So you're going to lose all of that, learning how to be a little moa or whatever it is. So yeah, I fear that these things will be highly confused and they'll just kind of stand there. And as you say, if you are kind of trying to study them to learn about moa behaviour, I don't see how you can tell if you're watching it, if it does something, whether that's an emu behaviour, a moa behaviour, or just a unique confused behaviour from that thing. So I don't know if anyone can predict what will happen when you kind of open the crate and let them walk out into the forest. How will they know what to eat or not eat?
Yeah.
So, I think that's an issue, and it's maybe the value is in finding out. I don't know. Is it just an experiment? But it's certainly not going to be a straight out of the box. The moa are back. Thank God for that. We've fixed everything. For a start, they won't be able to release them in the wild anyway, because they are GMOs, genetically modified organisms. So they're going to be kept in some kind of fenced sort of sanctuary. So we won't even get to know whether they're going to help bring the forests back again anyway. So they'll be in some kind of enclosure, and I guess we can watch what they do to the plants in there. But in terms of like, hey, great, we're restoring the forest back to quote unquote intact levels, that it's just not going to happen unless they change the law, and maybe that could happen.
Okay. Well, it does sound like there's a lot of challenges around that.
Yes, absolutely. It's a really interesting issue to kind of debate. There are a lot of angles to it.
So for you, you've written this book and there's been a lot happening since you wrote it, and I understand that it's been printed twice. It's a good read. It's in the library, but
Thank
it's
you.
also in the...
It's still available.
It's still available
in
to
shops.
purchase.
Yeah.
But, you must have felt a bit sad writing the book.
Oh, yeah, it's a sad story. There's no happy ending, They are gone, and just almost yesterday in kind of geological terms. And I grew up in that classic Kiwi kid running around the bush and investigating things, and the fact that you can't go and have that experience now is the sadness of extinction. And this de-extinction thing isn't going to change that. But I think it's an important lesson. The moa is a cautionary tale, and I think it's really important that we think of it that way. It is what happens if you take too much too quick, and then they're all gone. So we're duty bound to make sure that doesn't happen again, I think, on our watch. And we have things like the kakapo, which is really on the edge. Kiwi is not doing great in most places, so I think it's really on us to learn from what happened with the moa, to go, no, we can't take that away from future generations.
Thanks to my guest, Quinn Berenson, author of The Moa, The Life and Death of New Zealand's Legendary Bird. It's a fantastic read, it's got wonderful pictures, and Quinn has pulled together so much information. Also, if you get a chance to go to a talk by Quinn, he's a fantastic public speaker. Quinn's message is that moa are sadly gone, and no amount of genetic engineering is going to bring them back. However, our forests still remember them, and we're learning more and more about how their extinction still impacts on the functioning of native ecosystems today in terms of native sea plant dispersal and how our forests used to look like, especially perhaps the understory density of forest. Importantly, introduced herbivorous mammals can't replace moa species. They consume vegetation in very different ways that degrade our forests. And I agree with Quinn that the main lesson of the moa is a cautionary one, that we need to do everything we can to ensure the survival of our remaining taonga bird species. We still have incredible species hanging in there. We've got kakapo, takahe, our kiwi species. They need our help 100% to thrive and to take their place again in our native ecosystems. Thank you for listening to this episode. In my next episode, I'll be chatting with one of New Zealand's leading weed ecologists, Dr. Kate McAlpine, about exotic plant species that make good nursery plants for native forest. Until next time, I will leave you with the recreated vocalizations of the stout-legged moa, Eurypteryx curtis. Call Final 2016, audio by Bevan Smith to Papa 11460, and music to the ears of my guest, Quinn Berenson, a rewilder who likes letting nature take the lead.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.